Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you. My name is Dustin Cormier, and this is How to Rock Astrology. I'm very excited today to be bringing on my good friend, Fernando Raul Alvirez. I guess I should say Fernando Raul Castro Alvirez.
Yes,
Of
it's a
Fernando
Spanish name.
Raul. Wonderful. I love it. It's got such I love anything in Spanish is so flowery and just so full of vitality. Uh, Thank you so much for being on my show with me today, Fernando.
Thank you, Dustin. Thank you for inviting me. And I want to greet all your audience and, thank you for listening to us here.
Well, my audience is an eclectic audience. We're very used to having all sorts of different people here. So I'm very glad to be having you here. You are what could I say that you're a native Spanish speaker? Is that correct to say, Fernando?
Yes.
So,
I'm from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised, and
Puerto Rico.
Yes.
Okay, so you've really been doing a lot in the Spanish world of astrology. But I do know that you have an English-speaking YouTube channel where you have some real groundbreaking stuff that you talk about. So I'm glad to have you here.
I've done the majority of my work is in Spanish, but I've done I wouldn't say a considerate amount, but I've done quite a few videos in English, both in my channel and in other channels, just
Wonderful.
like this one right now.
So is it called Fernando Raul Astrology?
Yes.
That's how people are going to be able to find you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect, Fernando. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is that I should say to my audience that you went through the same rigorous, dirt-eating college experience that I did with Ryan Kirksack. And so you've gone through the 4 years of Asheville Vedic Astrology. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on here is because I know that you have at least gone through the same backbone of training that I have and of knowledge that I have. So many of my audience are going to know a lot of the stuff that you and I bounce from organically. Of course, both of us have taken our schooling from Asheville Vedic Astrology and absorbed it into our own intuitive understanding of what astrology is all about. So what would you say that you have going on that really stands out for you on your channel, Fernando? Would you like to give us a little gumball spiel of what you do on your channel?
Gumball spiel. Yeah, I'm gonna give you a gumball spiel.
Sure.
So basically, as you said previously, it's mainly a Spanish channel. So if you don't know Spanish, don't worry about it. But it's basically a channel where I try to talk about and teach traditional astrology. And even though I'm a modern man, I try to be a traditional astrologer and do traditional astrology in this modern world. And basically, you have that in my channel. Also, one of the other reasons why I mainly focus in Spanish, other than being my vernacular, obviously, is that unfortunately in the Spanish speaking world, which is quite considerate, taking into consideration all the countries that talk Spanish
is huge.
It's huge. Unfortunately, that there isn't a lot of serious material about Jyotish, and also there is very little serious material about traditional astrology. So it was a field that was unoccupied, and I just started doing my thing, and I've been doing it since 2017. And even though it's in Spanish, I take the opportunity to do these English collaborations with people like yourself in order to, expand my audience and practice my English also.
Of course. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you, Fernando.
And thank you for inviting me once again. Yeah.
Yes, my pleasure, buddy. Because I always find that even though, a chair is a chair, whether it's in Spanish or it's English or it's French, but there are things that another language that just X-ray scans reality in just a slightly different way. So it's very cool to have you here, letting your hand into the English-speaking world.
And that's something, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah,
that's something that really opens, Pandora's box, because once you, and you're Canadian, so you know French. So
a little bit, not as much as I should.
Yeah, but most Americans are monolingual, and once you dominate more than one language, you understand the things that are lost in translation. And
totally.
When you study astrology, you apply that to the texts, and you realize, wait a minute, I need to learn Sanskrit. I need to learn Greek. I need to learn Latin. I need to learn Arabic because
Mm.
there are a lot of things that we're never ever gonna really feel through the grittiness of the tongue in which
Mhm.
most texts were written in, right? But yeah,
Wonderful.
that's just
Well, it
a
makes
thought I
sense
just had.
for you to be a bilingual person. It must
Yeah.
be a very useful because the skills that you need in order
Uh-huh.
to be bilingual, I imagine must translate into being um multicultural, shall we say.
No, no, but I understood the idea of living in the idea of being by, the idea of being in
Mhm.
two places at the same time. Oh, definitely. And culturally speaking, Puerto Ricans like myself from the place I live
Mhm.
in Puerto Rico, we have that
Oh,
how
in
do you
your
call it, that diversity in terms of that those both worlds cohabiting in the same mental linguistic
space.
space. Yeah, because
Mhm.
we for example here, just for
Yeah, yeah.
for people to have fun, and I think it's more or less the same in Quebec. I know you're in Toronto, but
Mhm.
the idea here is that you study in high school, you study math and science in English, and sometimes you read more in English than in Spanish. So taking into consideration my cultural background and where I come from, you
Mhm.
are correct when you say that the idea of being able to
Very cool.
tiptoe into other cultures and live it through the vernacular that they speak.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Okay.
So Fernando, something that well, before we start, I'd like to
Uh-huh.
say, you are we just talked about your signs a little bit. I think
Yes.
everybody on my channel knows me. I'm born 1991. I'm a Leo rising, Scorpio sun, just like you.
Nice.
And I have Sagittarius moon. So
Perfect.
I'm Leo rising, Scorpio sun in the fourth, and then Sag moon in the fifth. And I'm Venus Atmakarika.
Cool.
Now, for you, Fernando, you have Sagittarius rising. Can really
Yes.
see that multicultural consciousness coming through. You have the sun in Scorpio, which would be at the 12th house. And you have the moon in Aquarius, which would be the third house.
Yes, sir.
And that sun in Scorpio is your Atmakarika.
Yes, sir.
And it's interesting that it's conjunct Ketu.
Yes.
To
And
have the
Venus also.
and Venus, no kidding. So to have the ninth lord, the sun, conjunct Ketu as your Atmakarika really probably lends a lot into a Ketu sort of consciousness.
To a certain degree, yes.
Understanding what Ketu is all about, the elimination of excess karma. I think it's very interesting that you became an astrologer.
Yeah, the Moksha Karka. Yes.
No kidding. Moksha
Yes.
Karaka. Very cool. I
Yeah.
like the way that you put that.
Thank you.
So, Fernando, thank you for giving us a little window into your soul nature. Now, one thing I want to ask you, and I kind of want to start right away with this. You and I have been discussing, we did a little bit of a conversation before we started. And I want to see if I can ground how we're going to go about this consciousness in a constructive way. You've talked a lot about what you would call traditional astrology.
Yes.
Now, many of the people on my channel probably understand my narrative that I typically describe things as such. You've already given me some terms that are making me change it. This, ladies and gentlemen, we're watching transformational definitions happen right now. So this is me trying to reach into my brain to describe that. When I talk to most of my audience, I usually say that before we had, consolidated understandings of astronomy, before we had consolidated understandings of astrology as well, there was a time when all we had was rishis. The rishis were seers who could see into the karma inside of their own energy field, the macrocosm of themselves, and they saw, oh, look, it reflects out in the stars, it reflects out in the planets. So there was a period where the rishis created, or at least uncovered, the ancient Sanskrit vocabulary that relates to the planets. And so this gives us the idea, an image of an untainted astrology, which these ancient seers who had clairvoyance could describe the truth of the energy of astrology. And this is what we could, I think we would call traditional astrology. I'm assuming this is what you would term it. Now, since time has passed from all those years where we had that traditional sense of astrology, a lot of people would concern this as Vedic. A lot of people consider the traditional astrology to be Vedic. Now, I'm coming to an understanding through watching you and through talking to you that the term Vedic is really just a thrown-on term, similar to the word Hindu. The Sanatan Dharma has been what it is from the beginning of time, but it has changed and transformed so much. And the Europeans, at a point in the 1600s, called what they saw in India Hindu, but that doesn't necessarily describe what was originally supposed to be happening in Samkhya philosophy and in the Sanatan Dharma. Things become bastardized over time and become diluted through conversations of people who didn't have the same clarity that those rishis did. So, as I've been understanding it, Fernando, you've been creating a difference of terminology between traditional astrology and what we are now calling modern astrology. Could you give us a little, first I'd like to ask, am I correct in how I'm describing traditional astrology, which I would almost call it a cultureless vantage of the truth of astrology? You mentioned that mathematics do not change amongst cultures, and astrology really is the same way. But astrology is such a vast science that it has been interpreted in many different ways. So, in your interpretation, Fernando, I wonder if you could give us a definition for what you call traditional astrology, and if you could describe how this is not the same as what we call modern astrology.
Okay, let's go over the things you just said.
Please do.
In terms of your definition, I know what you're saying, and even though I do not agree exactly 100% with what you just said, I would say that you could frame it like that.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the let's say the archetypical elder council, and the idea of how we are given a tradition throughout generations, then that is true.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm going to tell you what I know.
Yeah, go ahead, Fernando. And I should say, I've already told my audience that on my show, I often find that I have an idea about things and my presenter can have a different idea, or, I invite you to hit me with it, Fernando.
Okay.
You have such a good, passionate take on everything you do. If you completely steamroll what I just said, this is what I brought you here for.
No, you don't have to completely steamroll it. You just gotta steamroll the edges.
Yeah, I'm with you. Go ahead, buddy.
But the first thing that we need to know, and this is something that I do in my classes, and sometimes they hate me for it, and this is something other colleagues of mine do. If you're gonna study astrology, besides the obvious, right? You got to start with the basics and all that, which is something that most people don't do today. But the thing is that when you study astrology, you got to learn the etymology of the word. It's astrology, astrologos, right? Logos and astros. Astros and logos are both Greek terms.
Certainly.
And what they mean is the logos of the stars. Astro, like the Houston Astros, but it's the stars, right?
Gotcha.
So And when we talk about stars and logos, we got to realize that our modern conception of these words are not traditional conceptions. Because when you think about stars, you start thinking about the sun, you start thinking about blue giants, you start thinking about, blue dwarfs, white dwarfs, and red giants and all that. And those things, those terms, those ideas are not even 200 years old. Okay?
Totally. Very modern.
When you are talking about stars, first of all, you got to put yourself in a geocentric perspective, in a geocentric point of view, and you got to realize what stars are when you see them with your eyes. And there are two types of stars, and there are only two types of stars: fixed stars and moving stars.
Right.
And that is what you mean when you say astro in astrology. You're referring to those little specks of light. Some are moving, some are not, right? The ones that are moving are the saptagrahas, right? The traditional.
Yes. So to clarify, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word stars, they think of a difference between the stars and the planets. But in the traditional consciousness that was applied by ancient cultures, they would have looked out and they would have seen luminaries.
And not only that, but the idea of how stars work. The idea that we hold today is that stars are born through the concentration of helium and other elements, gases, and they start creating, and then they're big, and then they go small and they explode. That idea is also modern. So we got to see how the traditional perspective saw it. So we have the 7 moving stars and the fixed stars. So the 7 moving stars are obviously the 5 starry planets, the moon and the sun. And from a traditional perspective, usually, right, I believe this is like overall the idea, all of the lights of the stars come from the sun. Some people might think, whoa, wait a minute, no, stars are far away, light years away, Star Trek, Star Wars, whatever. No. The light from the geocentric perspective and the traditional perspective comes from the sun. So all of the stars, even though ones are moving and ones are fixed, come from the sun. So, that's just an idea in order for you and your audience to understand the difference between the traditional ethos and the modern ethos. Now, that is what stars are, which is getting to the main root of my argument here. So when we talk about astros, those are the stars that we're talking about. And each of the moving stars has particularities, and some fixed stars have particularities, but that we leave out of this explanation.
Gotcha.
What is the logos? When you go to a dictionary and you look for logos, you're going to see like a whole bunch of definitions, because logos is not like the logo you see for Taco Bell or McDonald's or the Milwaukee Bucks. I don't know, but the thing is that the logos is the word.
Logos.
Yes, logos.
Yes, and
like a logo, but with an S at the end.
It relates to the word logic.
Correct. Exactly.
Yes, I'm with you.
But more than anything else, it relates to God.
Yeah. Okay.
To God Almighty.
I think, I really almost feel, Fernando, that I feel like you're building this idea of a mystical and divine conception of human consciousness, which is that the sun, the Atma, is the soul inside of ourselves. And from the mythical, poetic vantage of spirituality, what's happening with the sun is the primordial arbiter of consciousness. Where
the primary arbiter of consciousness is God, which is not the sun. The sun might be a significator of God, but the sun is not God. God is superior to the sun. But what we're saying here is that you said it in a poetic. No. It's real. And that's the thing that we have to understand from a traditional perspective.
Love it. Cool, Fernando.
That God is real, right? And this is the most important thing when you are starting to learn astrology. And you got to understand this from a traditional perspective. If you're going to study astrology, you got to realize that truth exists. Truth, absolute truth exists. And absolute truth is God. Okay? This is the most important thing, because that is logos, right? So if you don't believe that absolute truth exists, you should not study astrology.
Cool.
Because if you do not understand this, then you are not going to do astrology. You're going to do other things. Now, this is what astrology means from a traditional perspective. It is looking at God, looking at the absolute truth, looking at the word, the logic, through the moving points of light that we see in the night sky. And it is through that conception that the definition of traditional astrology starts, because we got to realize that we live in an anomalous situation right now. For the past 250 years, we as descendants of Europeans, or descendants of people from the Mediterranean, from Christians, we have been going through a situation of revolution, where for the first time in our history and the history of the world, a society has been built on bases that are not traditional, which are modern, right? And we got to
Cool.
see ourselves as creatures of modernity. And as creatures of modernity, we have to understand what I'm saying about traditional astrology, because in the end, traditional astrology is the astrology that applies to the Weltanschauung, or more or less the worldview or the society where God is the center, where truth is the center, right? Where transcendence is the center. That is not the case of our modern society. Our modern society is an anomaly where God, transcendence, truth is no longer the center. The center is relativity. The center, and I don't mean that in the Einstein way. I mean the idea of everything's relative.
I think I understand where you're at. Yeah.
The center is subjectivity. The center is materialism. The center is economy. The center is the idea of becoming, not of being. And that creates a whole lot of situations that change human thought, that change society in a way that is anomalous. So that is just, the tip of the iceberg. We have to talk about other stuff, which differentiates traditional from modern astrology. But you have to take this into consideration in order to understand the differences between the traditional perspective and the modern perspective.
Because I really see that there can be a great a dilution that can happen from this modernity, and it's funny because I think that it must be happening for good reason as well. I would almost say, like, I'm thinking of a child who is born into one family and is kind of sheltered, let's say, and there's a root of who that child is in their family bones. But because they're only absorbing their family, they can't see it in context. So what the kid does is they go out and find friends and they explore other families and they see how other parents are with their children. And the kid can appreciate their originating family in context. What's happened, I think, with modernity is that child has forgotten its original family and now is trying to get a sense of what it is by seeing many different types of families, and now it is losing the essential sense of the rootedness of its originating family, which would have given it a sense of beingness as opposed to a sense of becoming. However,
like the prodigal son, yes, more or less.
The prodigal son. That's a great way to put it, Fernando. Yeah. So the prodigal son went out and he didn't think his family was all that good, and he came back and the family loved him all that much more when he came back.
Because you gotta go back. Exactly.
For sure. Very cool. So, and that's what we are doing as people who celebrate traditional astrology and
trying to do. Yeah.
Cool. All right. I hope I put that in the correct vantage there, Fernando.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and there are many other particularities between the differences between modern and traditional astrology, which we're not getting into. But the main focus here is absolute truth, and absolute truth does exist, and it is important in order for it to exist. Because when you know it exists and you reconnect with it, you start deriving all the necessary things that are needed for a healthy and a strong society. And that is religion, ethics, morality. And then you get the idea of what is good and what is bad, what is wrong and what is correct, what is ugly and what is beautiful. And those are the things that we've lost today in society. And obviously that has immense repercussions in a lot of areas. But in astrology, it will manifest in a particular way.
No kidding.
In a way where people who do astrology or modern astrology are not really doing astrology. They're doing modern things with an astrological mask. And I don't mean that in an ascendant way. I mean that in a way that they say they're doing astrology, but in the end, what they're doing is psychology, or what they're doing is just nihilism, or what they're doing is subversion, intuition. And don't get me wrong, intuition is something real. But astrology, in a way, when you really see it from the traditional perspective, it's not intuition, because intuition, you read the clouds, you read the coffee, you read cards,
the sticks, the tarot sticks,
which is more of a female divinatory nature.
Yes.
More of a male solar nature is the idea of logic. And astrology, once again, is based on absolute truth. So
it always
you can't,
was a solar science.
yeah, well, I wouldn't say a solar sign, but I would say more logical to a center, to a certain degree, which can be associated with the sun, which can be associated with males and that sort of thing. But the thing is that if you really study traditional astrology, there is no place for intuition. Intuition might come in when you talk to someone, the client, the situation you're in, right? The how do you call it in Indian? I forgot the word, but the signs, you know, the omens.
Omens.
That's more of an intuition, without a doubt, right? And you know, the type of intuition you get with other people. But when you're reading a chart, you know, you got to go to the math. And it's not necessarily math, but you got to go to the tradition. You got to go to what is there, because if it's based in truth, then there's no place for intuition. 2 + 2 is going to be 4 always.
Right.
So when you see Venus in Virgo debilitated, it's going to be that always, right?
Certainly.
And there's going to be things that are going to be negative, and there are things that might be positive, but they're going to be things that are mainly negative, right? It's not relativity.
Yeah.
It's the idea of knowing what is white and what is black.
Right.
And through that, you start doing astrology. Now, that you can get intuitions from those significators, of course, and that a lot of people do. But in the end, the what I recommend is in terms of doing traditional astrology, is that you leave intuition for other areas other than when you're reading the chart. Because when you do that, then you're not doing astrology, you're doing other things using astrology.
Right.
And I'm not saying that is wrong. What I'm saying is that in traditional astrology, that was not the case.
And that's what you're trying to discern here, because we're not demonizing anybody. Gotcha. So we're not demonizing anybody for practicing various different types of astrology, but we are trying to discern between what we would call the originating philosophy of absolute truth applied to Jyotish.
What you're doing there is differentiating tradition from modernity, right? Because as you were saying before, you know, the ancient rishis, you know, or any ancient astrologer per se, as for example, you know, intuition came into being, but the idea of the laws, the ideas of the things you got to know by heart are going to be there always. And that's why, once again, Venus in Virgo has some particularities. Jupiter in Cancer has other particularities. Planets in the 10th, planets in the 1st have certain particularities. And that is based from what we have received and still is alive about real astrology. Right. So the thing is the worldview, right? The worldview is very important. Because once you understand the worldview, everything else will fall into place, specifically if you're studying astrology. Now, obviously, this is for the person who wants to delve into the study and delve into the history and the culture of something that has been happening for at least 2,000 years. Right. And the idea of just, you know, shunning all that tradition, or just changing that tradition, or just saying that that tradition was something that was never, that it never was, then, you know, that's something that is to be considered very seriously, because you are just, you know, cutting, you know, a transgenerational, transcivilizatory relay of an art and a science based in truth. And, you know, that's part of the idea of the difference between the traditional outlook and modernity.
Very cool, Fernando. Okay. So, you know, I kind of want to ask you, you know, we could really grill this particular subject for a long time.
Claro. Yeah.
So, you know, I do want to say, I would say that, would you almost consider that the derivation which most people give as Vedic astrology, you know, we could certainly say that what you and I have practiced with Asheville Vedic Astrology is closer to what we would call Vedic Jyotish than any sort of Hellenistic-based, what is typically called Western astrology. So my question to you is, would it be right to say that both Vedic and Western astrology could be applied to the label of modern interpretations, which are a different from what we would call a traditional synopsis of how to describe
mainly
astrology.
yes, the majority of them, yes.
Okay.
Both Vedic and so-called Western astrology.
All right.
Well, I'm sorry, are you going to say something else?
Well, I think that was it, Fernando, because I think a lot of people would consider, what the hell, I'll just go out and say it. I kind of was under the understanding that Vedic astrology would have been a particularly very traditional style of astrology based in that was originally done in India.
Yes.
But I guess what modern practitioners are practicing as Vedic astrology aren't necessarily what are stuck into those absolute roots of philosophy.
Correct.
The tropical and sidereal debate really shows that, sidereal astrology is still can be applied as Vedic astrology, but that doesn't mean it's abiding by traditional standards.
Also, well, the sidereal zodiac is a special case. So the sidereal zodiac is basically it is a unique manifestation of the Indian subcontinent.
Right.
And the mixture and the fusion of both Hellenistic and autochthonous Vedic astrological things that have come to be in the way it is because of a specific and special cultural situation there. That aside, what you said before that is correct. Vedic astrology, or better said, Jyotisha, is traditional astrology, just like Perso-Arab Islamic astrology is traditional astrology, just like Hellenistic astrology is traditional astrology, and so as it is medieval and Renaissance Christian astrology. Well, European Christian astrology is also traditional. Yes. Traditional astrology was, in order to see it from a bigger perspective and in terms of a chronology, it's basically the astrology that was practiced more or less until the early 18th, late 17th century. So you have 17th century back, traditional, 17th century onward, or early 18th century onward is modern.
Modern. Okay.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Why? Because in that space of time between, the 17th and the 18th century, you start having the scientific revolutions. You start having also the
cultural mixing.
The aftermath of the Reformation, or how the world is secularizing itself, how it's separating from God. Okay, how it's becoming more modern, and that through globalization will spread all throughout the world. And now in the 2020s, we see it as the norm. And also, summarizing a long time in a very short moment. But the thing is that being said, Vedic astrology obviously is traditional astrology. But the thing that I want to say is that number one, that term Vedic astrology is an anathema. It was basically created in the 60s, so it's a modern term. Gotcha. Also, before that, in the 19th century, which was when the majority of people in Europe knew Sanskrit and knew what Jyotish was, they called it Hindu astrology. Now, the correct term is Jyotish. What I mean is that today's Vedic astrology, and the majority of the people who practice Vedic astrology, are not practicing traditional Jyotish. What they're doing is practicing modern astrology with the mask of Vedic astrology, both Westerners and Indians, both of them.
Yes.
It's very interesting because it's a particular thing that I want to delve upon that has been touched upon other places, but now that I have more experience and I've read more, I think I can, give a little bit more. And I just want to take a few minutes, if you may.
Oh, but absolutely, Fernando.
But the thing is that Jyotish today is mainly modern astrology done with a Jyotish mask. Okay, and most Westerners today are people who have a modern ethos, people who don't believe in absolute truth, like among many other things. But the thing is that it's a modern ethos using the Vedic mask, sometimes subversively, sometimes iconoclastically, or sometimes very genuinely. But the thing is that what they're doing is psychological, evolutionary astrology, which is not Indian, which is not traditional. Reincarnation in the Sanatana Dharma is not something you want. It's something you want to avoid.
Yeah, cool.
And evolutionary astrology is just an invention of modernity.
Yeah,
and
it's
unfortunately,
Darwinianism
yes,
applied
correct.
to a spirituality, which is
Evolution does not exist at all in terms of the Darwinian paradigm. Obviously, you know, from a semantic point of view, obviously evolution exists because you grow, you learn, and you die, whatever. But the idea of the term of modern evolution does not exist. Right. So you cannot use that with traditional astrology because you're not doing traditional astrology. What you're doing is using your modern ethos through that vehicle that has survived and that you call Vedic astrology, but it's just, you know, it's just the shambles of it. It's just the skeleton of it, right? So you got to take this into consideration. Most of Vedic Jyotish today, or Jyotish, or most of Vedic astrology today, is not real astrology because you got to take into consideration the historical developments. You know, the idea that, well, I do practice Vedic astrology because my master was the master of this and that and that. And that's what some people do in India, not necessarily in the West, although there are people who study with people who have that lineages and parampara. But the problem is that if you read people like K.N. Rao, which is probably the most important Vedic astrologer today alive, he's almost 90 or 90 something, you know, he in the 20th century, you have two great Vedic astrologers. You have B.V. Raman, and then you have K.N. Rao. And if you read his books, he's going to tell you, you know, there's no such thing as a pure parampara in India. The Muslim invasions changed that, and then the British changed that.
Totally.
I know there are people that say they have lineage specifically from the East and a specific teacher, but the idea is that a lot of people, serious people, and K.N. Rao was a secular guy. He was an accountant for the Indian government, okay? And then he went about India, staying in different ashrams with yogis and stuff. And that's his books are really good. I recommend them. But the point is that he said that. And if you realize what these people who say that have this lineage, what they say, what they're saying, they're just saying modern things, modern stuff. The idea of reincarnation, of evolutionary reincarnation, is just something ridiculous.
That's
the idea
been applied,
yes, the idea of the nodes as being carcass of reincarnation of past and future lives, that is Western, that is modern, that is from the last 100 years. And there are other examples, but what I mean to say is that Vedic astrology today is a lot like modern astrology. And at the same time, even though they call it Western astrology, what they're saying is modern astrology, because modern astrology is the same in all places of the world. Doesn't matter if it's India, Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, North America. It's the same anomalous manifestation of a worldview that is contrary to our organic nature. Now, astrology is just one thing. It's astrology. And it started, academically speaking, in Egypt and in Chaldea, in Mesopotamia. Gotcha. Indians are going to say another thing, but that's something to leave in the club. But just to summarize and give you the word fast, you know, it started there, and then it got fused together in the Hellenistic context of the 2nd century BC with Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic Empire, or the Macedonian Empire, how you want to call it. And that's the birth of modern horoscopic astrology. It was the 2nd century BC in the Mediterranean, where you have the birth of the horoscopic astrology, which is based in 5 basic things: planets, signs, houses, aspects, and the ascendant. Before that, there was nothing like that before that. There was ideas of rudimentary astrology, of rudimentary solar astrology, eclipses, stars, and all that. But the idea of what we know today as horoscopic astrology, which is the base for natal, electionary, muhurtas, prashnas, horary, magical, and mundane.
Gotcha.
That is the base. And then it spread out through the world. And then it got to India, where it got mixed with the traditional Jyotish, which was specifically based on the 6 parampara, which was to know when to do the things that you have to do, when to do the ceremonies, the sacrifices, to know the times, right? Which was like a rudimentary muhurta astrology or electional astrology for that moment.
More of a yogi sort of thing, just for yogis to know the best times to do things.
Not only yogis, I mean, fathers,
everybody, you're right.
Mothers, families, everyone. So the thing is that through that, you have the spread of horoscopic astrology. Then you have the Hellenistic world, Greece, then you have Rome. At the same time, it's in India, and then it starts spreading. And then after the 4th century, when the Mediterranean becomes Christian, that slowly emigrates to the east while it becomes very underground in Europe. And then you start having the Muslim Islamic manifestations, which are awesome. And at the same time, India gets secondarily influenced by astrology once again through that Muslim influence. That Muslim influence also gets to China, but then it comes back to Europe in the 12th, 11th century through translations, and then you start having the same movement of astrology once again in the late medieval period until it ends in the 17th century. Now, astrology did continue in the Muslim world to a certain degree. The last Sultan of Turkey in the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s had an astrologer. Many courts of kings had astrologers in Europe till the 17th century. So it was still around there, but starting from modernity, from the 17th and 18th century, things are just disappearing in terms of what astrology was, because man starts thinking in another way. Remember,
would you say that the secularization of the world that was happening at this time in the Renaissance era was really a big part of this derivation between?
Oh no, definitely. No, you hit you hit the nail on the, you have 3 big things. Well, 4. You have 4, but it's 3 big historical things. The Protestant Reformation, 16th century. Then you have the Enlightenment, which is late 18th century, right? And then Protestant, the Enlightenment with the French Revolution, and then you have the whole industrial revolutions, in which we are about to begin the 4th one, right? And then you also have the thing with the 19th century and the 20th century revolution. So yes, it's the secularization, because you got to realize, Dustin, and people who are hearing they're hearing this, there is no paradigm, there's no difference between religion and science. It's the same thing. But through modernity, we have left out the religious thing. We have left the rite. We have left the tradition. We have left God. And now we only pay attention to what we can prove through our 5 senses in our mind, which is very good. Modern, pragmatic science. Now, so this is very important, because through the historical development, you start understanding that now in the 20th century, 19th century, the only place where astrology was alive was in India. And then you go there, which they also had a lot of difficulties with the Muslims. I mean, the Muslims in the Muslim invasions of India are the most horrible things you can read about. I mean, really, really bad. I mean,
I've heard that.
Really, like top 5 worst things in history. And then you have the idea of the British coming in, which also changed stuff. It was a
pretty bad one, too.
So astrology in India is also suffering. And if you read what B.V. Raman said, the astrology that was practiced in early 20th century India was very rudimentary. They didn't use all these pargas and all this stuff. That's something that was developed later on in this century to Westerners through Indians, but from a modern perspective.
Certainly.
And like I said before I end, we're just like anthropologists looking for what's truth and what's not. And right now we are trying to reconstruct what the traditional astrology was, because we see that in India there are techniques that were used in Greece. We see techniques that were used in the Muslim world, and these are worlds where astrology does no longer have a prominent place in society, and India is the only place where it does have that today. And that is the importance of Vedic astrology. It is a place to go if you want to start your journey into this idea of what traditional astrology is. And I'm sorry I took so much time.
No, not at all, Fernando. I think that's great, because to be honest with you, in the modern context, I find myself, philosophy is really, like, I think any good astrologer really at some level should be a philosopher first.
He should be a theologist first.
Theologist is the proper word.
Yes. Okay,
I
understand. No. Philosophy is important, but the idea is that from the modern perspective, we believe that philosophy is the most high thing, when in the medieval period, philosophy was just, it was called natural philosophy, because it was the things you could touch. And from a traditional perspective, the massification in terms of the material, right? The materiality is the lowest expression of reality. But then we said, no, that's the only thing that exists. Magic,
Right.
God.
Yeah. That's all fancy
That doesn't
stuff.
exist. That doesn't exist. But the idea is that in the traditional sense, in our culture, in our tradition, theology was the queen of all studies. And then secondarily, although there's debate about that, came in astronomy or astrology. And then came natural philosophy. After the scientific revolutions, theology goes out the window.
No kidding.
Astrology goes out the window. And now the only thing is philosophy. And then you have, the moderns. You have Descartes, Descartes.
Yep.
Descartes. And then you have all the idea of how philosophy and modern philosophy develops until today, where we have just, a mush, it's just chaos.
Dog's breakfast.
Yes, but astrologers, I would recommend, need to study theology. And if you're gonna do,
or at least practice it,
no, you need to study, because if you're gonna do Jyotish, then you gotta go and get a guru and start learning Sanatana Dharma, because Jyotish is the sixth Vedanga, people. Of six. It's the last thing you learn. It's like before that, you got to learn a lot of other things. If you want to do it traditionally, you got to look for a teacher.
So this works with what I was trying to piece together, Fernando. Because
and not only that, let me finish.
Sure.
And at the same time, if you want to go practice Muslim astrology, you got to go to a tariq, or you got to go to somebody who does Sunni Sufism or Sufism, and just learn how it is. And if you want to study also astrology within the context of the logos, you got to learn theology.
Certainly.
And that is part of the worldview that I'm trying to reinforce here to your audience. I'm sorry, Dustin, continue.
Oh, thank you, Fernando. No, that's I think that you are getting at some incredibly important things. And I think that it's an important consciousness that has to be applied here, because I find myself as a modern astrologer, or whatever, that's what I'm going to have to say, because we're in modern times. I find a lot of the times I have many insights to share, which I have to bastardize it into an atheistic language for many of the people who are around me, many of my peers, anybody who I talk to about it, even most astrologers that I talk to about it. They also want to be able to explain it to their brother and their sister at home, so that they don't feel like too much of a weirdo, because the world nowadays is very secular. And I'm almost wanting to ask if you would consider, because I'm kind of just going around here a little bit, Fernando. I'm thinking of the fact that we would consider Vedic Jyotish as a practice or a science or a art of light. Oh, looks like I might have lost Fernando here. Sorry, folks. It looks like my internet is being a little bit funky on me. I wonder if I can get Fernando back here. Story of my life. You just have to give me one moment here, folks. I suppose this happens. We're pretty far into our reading here. So at least everything we've gotten in this video is going to be useful so far. Hey there, Fernando.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you okay.
I'm sorry, something exploded here.
That's okay, buddy. It happens.
Let me get my earphones.
Sure, buddy. Cool.
The lights went out. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Well, thank God.
It's okay. I have solar panels. Don't worry about that.
Awesome. Well, take your time, Fernando. For everybody watching, Fernando's just getting his stuff ready here. I think that he had a little bit of a power outage at his house.
No, a big one.
Big one.
No, it was in the whole.
Did you hear a pop? Did a transformer?
Yeah. It was that. It's a transformer. Yeah.
Yep, I've heard that. Did you Usually it makes a big teal cerulean color if you could see it, but those are intense. Okay, all right, Fernando. I wonder if we can still keep rolling with back to where we kind of were there. Let's see if we can get Fernando to, unfortunately, Fernando's internet is kind of clipping out right now. So well, folks, if this, if it turns out that we need to redo this video, which we, or not necessarily redo it, but we did a lot of talk about philosophy today in this conversation. Fernando's just kind of tuning back in now. What I'm thinking is that we might end most
Here
of
I
this.
am. Here I am.
Hey, buddy, you're here with me, buddy.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. I was in my Wi-Fi, but there's no Wi-Fi still, so I gotta go with the plan. So yeah.
Okay,
I'm
cool.
back.
Thanks,
I'm
buddy.
sorry. I'm sorry about that.
No problem, Fernando. So what I was kind of thinking, maybe we'll if you're into this, Fernando, I don't know how much time you have, but I was kind of thinking
I have about 3 hours, so I'm okay.
You got lots of time. Perfect. What I was thinking, Fernando, we've had a pretty good conversation about the general philosophy here of what we would call traditional astrology versus the emanations of people in modern times applying their modern awareness to these traditional understandings of astrology. So to wrap it up, I really think I'm getting an interesting idea of Jyotish as a geocentric mythos of truth, which is talking about how the light of the points of all the luminaries external to us are reflecting our internal soul data. And
well, the thing is that's the idea of how it works. Nobody knows. So
this is the fun that we're playing with, especially with people who are scientifically minded, or at least modern minded, shall we say.
Yeah, that's the thing, because the idea that stars create situations is just simply not truth, because if that was the case, then everybody with, I don't know, a Cancer Lagna with the moon. No, that's not a good example. Let's say a Taurus Lagna with Venus in the second house in Gemini would have all the same results. And it's not like that. So it's not that. Nobody really knows how astrology works. There have been people who have had different theories. So when you're saying what you're saying, that's your opinion.
Cool.
And the thing is that there's really no way to figure out how it works, but that it works and that it can work is something that man has seen throughout the centuries and the millennia. So yes, I'm sorry to
wonderful interrupt. No, that's good, Fernando, buddy. So what I was thinking is that we've really done a good consciousness of like a historical backdrop on what we would call traditional Jyotish versus the modern way that it's being applied. Now, I wonder if you would be interested if you're still down to hang out with me, maybe we'll call this a video, because it's just under an hour now at this point. Maybe we'll take a moment, we'll go to the bathroom. And if you're into it, Fernando, I'd like to talk a little bit about the specific points that we were thinking of talking about and make it into another video.
Sure.
Do you think that's a good idea? All right.
Rock and roll, we can do it.
So for everybody watching, Fernando, I usually, I put these out in very scattered times in my timeline of unfoldment. So for everybody watching, I hope you've enjoyed this philosophical talk with Fernando. If you keep your eyes peeled, probably in the next few months, I believe, we're going to be putting out the next video, which is talking a little bit more about some specific astrological figures, such as we're going to talk about the Trans-Saturnian planets. Fernando has a specific point about this. We're going to talk a little bit about how the Trans-Saturnians do not correlate with the chakras. That's something that we've wanted to talk about. We're going
to are not part of traditional astrology at all.
Part of traditional astrology at all. So I'd love to hear your point on that. As well, we're going to say a little word about Vargas and Dashas. So for everybody watching now, stay tuned. The next time Fernando comes on, it's going to be nice and tasty and sharp. Thanks for being with us here, Fernando. And I'll see you guys in the next one that we do.